Tower of Babel is one of the most dramatic stories in the Bible. It tells of the construction of a vertigo-inducing tower that reaches to heaven.
You'd see this large, mountain-like shape coming up out of the horizon.
But angered by his people's betrayal, God takes action to stop progress in its tracks. It's a fantastical tale, but an incredible new discovery suggests that the Tower of Babel was not simply a work of fiction.
There's no doubt about it that this jolly well existed, and this is a picture of it.
And experts now believe they know where the legendary tower once stood.
That's a real brick from the Tower of Babel.
Could these be the remains of the greatest lost wonder of the ancient world? The relics of the past hold secrets. Written in gold, stone, and blood. We can unlock them. These are the secrets of history's greatest treasures. Modern-day Iraq, a country ravaged by a decade of war. But despite the years of hostility under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, evidence still survives from an unbelievably rich and colorful past. 2,500 years ago, this was the center of a vast region called Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. And these are the remains of its capital, a city that has become fabled in folklore, but that actually existed: Babylon.
Babylon was a real place. It was definitely a city. It was excavated during the late 19th century by a German expedition, and it certainly certified that this was Babylon.
It was German archaeologist Robert Koldewey who first identified the buried ruins of Babylon in 1899. For 18 years, his team worked relentlessly to expose the lost metropolis that had been buried under 2,000 years of shifting sand.
Babylon was a very large city, certainly more than 100,000 people, perhaps even more than that, 150, 200,000 might be somewhat reasonable.
The ruins of Babylon revealed many secrets about the lost city. But Koldewey was convinced that within the rubble, he'd find the remains of a building that had become a legend. The Tower of Babel, the subject of one of the strangest stories in the Bible.
According to the Bible, God punished mankind for their arrogance in trying to reach heaven.
The tale is set when the whole of Earth spoke one language. It tells of the construction of a building like no other.
Let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven.
The Bible tells us that when God sees the Tower of Babel, he is enraged.
Let us go down and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech.
God's anger stops construction in its tracks. He scatters the population across the earth, and multiple languages are spawned.
God got cross, decided this was arrogant behavior, had to be punished, had to be stopped.
It's an incredible story, but could it be based on truth? Robert Koldewey, the man who uncovered the ruins of Babylon, believed it was. More than a century later, another archaeologist is determined to prove Koldewey was right.
I get people saying to me, Babylon, I thought that was just a legend, but that's only a myth. And I say, no, I've been working here since 2009.
Jeff Allen is a program director for the World Monuments Fund. He's been working in Iraq to preserve the archaeological remains of the once lost city. A city that astonishingly was made almost entirely of mud.
What we're looking at here are the inner city walls of Babylon. They were made out of mud brick. In the ancient Babylonian times, mud brick was the foundation for most structures. That is, it's the building block upon which most of their architecture was built.
Incredibly, over 2,000 years after Babylon was built, many of the city's mud brick structures have been unearthed. They give archaeologists a clue as to the sheer scale and grandeur of the ancient city. When the original excavations began in 1899, one of the biggest structures they uncovered was the Ishtar Gate, a vast entrance to the city named after a Babylonian goddess.
If you're a visitor, you wanted to visit a city like Babylon, which was at the time the world's largest city, you wanted to at least set the right tone when someone arrived that this was a place of serious reckoning, and it was a place that was important. And I think this is like advertising to the world that this is a great, powerful kingdom that you're about to enter into.
As Koldevai's team unearthed more of the grand city entrance, they found thousands of fragments of colored brick. Today they survive as part of a full-size recreation of the Ishtar Gate, the star attraction at a Berlin museum. So if the ancient Babylonians could create a structure as grand as the Ishtar Gate, could they have used the same mud brick technology to build a skyscraping structure like the Bible's Tower of Babel? Evidence suggests that the Ishtar Gate was just a part of a massive building project undertaken in Babylon during the 6th century BC. But who was behind it? A name stamped into hundreds of the unearthed mud bricks provides the answer: King Nebuchadnezzar II, a ruler whose ambitions for Babylon were on a scale that dwarfed any other city of its time.
The city of Babylon was already a very large, impressive city even before the time of Nebuchadnezzar. He did not simply want to replicate his predecessors. He wanted to go above and beyond what they were doing. He made it even more impressive.
By 590 BC, Babylon had established itself as the epicenter of Nebuchadnezzar's vast empire. An empire that stretched from modern-day Israel to the borders of Iran, north into Syria, and south into Arabia.
Babylon was essentially a center, a major center of the known civilized, if you will, world during this time period. So it was a large empire for its day, spanning much of the Near East.
As a ruler, Nebuchadnezzar had a fierce reputation. A skilled warrior, described in the Bible as a destroyer of nations. But while ruling with an iron fist, he was determined to leave his mark on the city. And evidence suggests he did. A detailed account of what Nebuchadnezzar actually planned can be found in London's British Museum. This clay tablet was uncovered in Iraq in the 17th century. Its ancient text reveals his master plan for supersizing Babylon.
This splendid object is called the East India House inscription of King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. And we have lots of inscriptions from this king because he rebuilt the city, and when he did all these operations, they were written down, they were recorded so that no one would ever forget. And he explains, basically, what he did to change the face of Babylon.
Nebuchadnezzar's vast construction program utilized millions of mud bricks to create an ancient metropolis, a city like no other in the ancient world.
But if you want to get a handle on what Babylon was like, it was probably something like Manhattan, where you have skyscrapers and very expensive public buildings and monumental buildings. Everyone has heard of Babylon, and it actually is a reflection of the splendor of the city and the lavish way it was decorated.
But could Nebuchadnezzar's vision really have stretched as far as the towering structure detailed in the Bible? A real Tower of Babel. Back in 1913, after 15 years of excavations, the German archaeologists made an earth-shattering discovery. But flooding and war would make further exploration impossible. Until now.
I thought as a kid this was folklore or legend, and that a lot of people still think of it in biblical terms as some kind of legend, but they don't really know that it actually existed. I'm really at the place where the tower stood.
The Tower of Babel is the Bible's apocalyptic tale of the construction and destruction of a mighty stairway to heaven that incurred the wrath of God. But could this fantastical structure really have existed? In 1913, German archaeologists unearthing the ruins of Babylon claimed they'd found evidence that it did. Now, thanks to satellite technology, the true scale of their discovery can be revealed. Could these be the foundations of the fabled tower? For decades, constant flooding from the nearby Euphrates River has made access impossible. But now, after the driest summer in over 50 years, the foundations have finally emerged.
This is a rare moment when the water table is extremely low in Iraq this summer, and it's going to allow us a chance to actually go down in an area that's usually off limits because of flooding. As you can see, an imprint is left on the surface after excavations that show you roughly the profile and outline here at Babylon.
The sheer size of the foundations suggests that thousands of years ago, work began here on a vast construction. Since 2009, archaeologist Jeff Allen has been forced to study the flooded excavations from the banks. This once-in-a-lifetime opportunity will finally allow him to step down into the recently exposed foundations.
Normally where I'm standing, I'd be waist deep in water, actually about this high, judging by the water lines. But because we're here during a very dry summer, the base surrounding the core is actually dry. So we're able to get a better concept of the size of what this tower was thousands of years ago.
During the original excavations back in 1913, archaeologists recorded each of the four sides to be just over 90 meters long. That's nearly 300 feet, the same length as a football field.
So, I've now walked about 90 paces, and given my tall height, that's about a meter a pace, along the east side of the Tower of Babylon. And it's another 90 meters that way till we reach the northeast corner.
The foundations only prove construction was started. There are no clues here to confirm the structure was actually completed. But an ancient tablet from 6th century Babylon, now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, provides tantalizing evidence of a finished structure like no other. The Essa Gila tablet describes the dimensions of a sky-scraping tower with foundations of the exact same measurements as those found in Babylon. Crucially, the ancient tablet also reveals the height of the building.
There's actually a lot of information in this Louvre tablet, so if you're a good mathematician and a very careful draftsman, you can make a good reconstruction in your mind on the basis of this inscription in Paris.
Incredibly, the tablet describes a structure that reached an astonishing 300 feet into the sky. It was called the E Temenanki. Translated, it means House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. The name eerily echoes the Bible's description of a tower whose top reaches to heaven.
When one's visualizing this building with the assistance of this ancient inscription, it is remarkable that the ground plan is 90 by 90, but also the height of the building is also 90 meters. So the thing was conceived as a huge block.
the foundations provide evidence that the project began. And the Esagila tablet reveals the dimensions for an entire structure. But was it actually possible to build a 300-foot tall tower in Babylon, a city made almost entirely of mud bricks? To find out, Dr. Stephen Ressler, a leading expert in ancient building methods, will use 21st century technology to test the limitations of the primitive building material.
My goal is to determine, as best we can from an engineering perspective, if Etemenanke could actually have been constructed. Could this massive structure have been built to a height of 90 meters or so and actually stood up, carried load structurally, given that it was made of a relatively weak structural material, mud brick?
Today, using steel, a 300-foot tower needs a foundation of as little as 50 feet square, a fraction of the foundations at Babylon. But a simulated stress test reveals that a modern-shaped structure built of mud bricks would have been impossible in ancient times.
You can see the different stress levels are indicated by different colors, whereas red is the highest stress and blue is the lowest. And red is actually showing that the stress is beyond the capability of the material. That means the tower would break.
The huge stresses incurred by the rectangular design are too great for the mud bricks at the base of the tower. If the Tower of Babel had been this shape, it would have crashed to Earth. But would a massive tower with the footprint of the Babylon foundations have been any better?
Let's look at the alternative where the tower is wider, see if adding that width gives us any advantage.
Here again, we see that the stress is increasing with height and that we have the highest stress at the bottom and the lowest at the top as expected. Here again, we have a red area indicating that this tower would also crush.
The second test shows a significant reduction in stress throughout the structure. But if the Tower of Babel had been this design, the sheer weight of materials would have caused the bricks at the base of the tower to shatter. The tower would once again have collapsed. So could any structure withstand the weight of 300 feet of piled high mud bricks? One ancient megastructure offers clues to what design could have worked. This is Iraq's Great Ziggurat of Ur. Located less than 200 miles from Babylon, it's the first stage of a Mesopotamian stepped tower. Built over 4,000 years ago, just after Egypt's Great Pyramid of Cheops, it's a rare survivor of a mud brick tower. Importantly, it was built 1,500 years before the fabled Tower of Babel.
So the Ziggurat of Ur was a stage tower as well that was built in the city of Ur during the late 3rd millennium BC under the so-called Ur III kingdom. It's the best preserved ziggurat that we know of in southern Mesopotamia. And because it's well preserved, we can get a better idea what a ziggurat looks like.
Today, only the first stage of the Great Ziggurat of Ur survives. Ancient records have revealed that originally it would have been the largest of 4 platforms, towering over 130 feet into the sky. But despite its vast size, this ancient structure was less than half the height of the tower described in the Esagila tablet.
So if you go to Ur today, you would see this well-preserved, very impressive-looking ziggurat. But if you went to Babylon in the 6th century BC, you would see an even more impressive structure, twice the size of the ziggurat at Ur.
So can modern-day science prove that a 300-foot-high tower could have been constructed using a ziggurat design?
So let's look at the ziggurat. Let's look at the pyramidal shape and see if we get any advantage from that shape.
This shows also the buildup of the height, shows also the different stresses by color. Again, red is the highest, and we can see there is no red anymore. This tower would survive its own weight.
That's fascinating. It really seems to suggest that these ancient engineers knew what they were doing.
Incredibly, science proves that the Tower of Babel could have existed, and all the evidence suggests it was a ziggurat. A huge multi-tiered platform crowned with a temple shrine. The Etemenanke was a tower that rose up towards heaven, just like the Bible's Tower of Babel.
Based on these analysis results, it seems to me that it is entirely feasible that Etemenanke existed, that it could be built, and that it could be built to its advertised height.
In theory, it would have been possible to build the Tower of Babel. And now, an incredible discovery will reveal just what this ambitious ancient wonder actually looked like to the people of Babylon over 2,500 years ago.
There's no doubt about it that this jolly well existed, and this is a picture of it.
The fragile remains of the legendary city of Babylon in modern-day Iraq have revealed many secrets. The greatest of all was the discovery of a vast structure that ancient records suggest was the Tower of Babel. A sky-scraping monument from one of the Bible's most incredible stories. Ancient texts have allowed experts to imagine what the building might have looked like. But now, astounding new evidence has emerged. Inscribed on the surface of a privately owned tablet is an image that sensationally reveals exactly what the Tower of Babel looked like.
This is a very strong piece of evidence that the Tower of Babel story in the Bible was inspired by this real building.
This remarkable tablet, which has never been filmed before, dates to the 6th century BC. It was discovered in Babylon over a century ago. Unbelievably, no one realized how important it was until Professor Andrew George, an expert in ancient texts, brought its faint carvings back to life.
At the top here, this part, there is a relief depicting a stepped tower, and here a figure of a human being carrying a staff and with a conical hat on. Below that relief is text which has been chiseled into the monument, and the label is easily read. It reads Etemenanke Zikurat Babeli, and that means the zikkurat or temple tower of the city of Babylon.
This tablet provides the first ever image of the real Tower of Babel. It confirms the building was a Mesopotamian stepped tower and illustrates the 7 tiers of the ancient megastructure. Significantly, it also clearly identifies the man behind it, Mesopotamia's most famous ruler, King Nebuchadnezzar II.
The building and its builder on the same relief.
But while the images are extraordinary, the tablet's ancient text also reveals a detailed account of the tower's construction, and more importantly, how Nebuchadnezzar went about building it.
It reads from the upper sea, which is the Mediterranean, to the lower sea, and that's the Persian Gulf. The far-flung lands and teeming people of the habitations are mobilized in order to construct this building of the Zikkurat of Babylon.
Incredibly, this ancient account is identical to the biblical story of how the Tower of Babel was constructed. For scholars, the tablet offers further proof that the Tower of Babel wasn't just a work of fiction. It was an actual building from antiquity.
It's got everything on it, really, and not only the picture and the king and the profile and the map, but also in the text. When you look at this object, the whole thing is like encapsulated into one convincing bar of gold, that there's no doubt about it, that this monument, as we understand it from the Bible, jolly well existed, and this is a picture of it.
But if the remains discovered in Iraq were the Tower of Babel, the mythical stairway to heaven, where were the stairs? It's the question the original excavation team were determined to discover back in 1913. Incredibly, they found what they were looking for.
These are photos from the original excavations over 100 years ago. And somewhere in here, they found the beginning steps of Itemenki. And these steps led to my left up towards the central part of the tower.
The evidence from the ruins in Iraq, the ancient tablet descriptions, the mud brick analysis, and the account of the tower's construction create a compelling case that the Tower of Babel was real. But how did the biblical story come about? For experts, the answer can be found by looking back to one of the most significant events in history. In 586 BC, in a bid for world supremacy, King Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, 500 miles to the west. His army sacked the city and captured the most highly skilled and highly educated citizens. Brought to Babylon as prisoners of war, they were forced to work for Nebuchadnezzar. It was the start of what's now known as the Babylonian captivity. But crucially, while in Babylon, the captives became known as the Jewish people, the very authors of the Bible.
That experience converted them into the Jewish people. And those, of course, are the people who wrote the Old Testament, who produced the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, which we all know about.
I think very likely the Jewish population exiled in Babylon in the 6th century BC by Nebuchadnezzar very likely utilized the tower as their inspiration for the Tower of Babel story in the Bible. They may have seen it as a symbol of their oppression, essentially, this large looming building where they lived in this foreign city, a culture they didn't know very well. And so I think it became symbolic to them.
Experts are now certain the Bible's Tower of Babel was real. And there's a compelling clue in the story that backs up a theory that Jewish slaves witnessed the tower being built during their time in captivity. This is an original brick from Babylon. It carries traces of an unusual construction material from the time: bitumen, an ancient tar mortar that's specifically mentioned in the biblical tale.
Tucked in the corner of this case is something very interesting for people who are interested in the Tower of Babel, because this is one of the actual bricks which Nebuchadnezzar commissioned. We know it's Nebuchadnezzar because there's a stamped inscription on the front. Down the edge you can see this murky black stuff. This is bitumen. In the book of Genesis, it literally says that they use brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. It's expressly said there. What we have here is one brick and its bitumen, which fits exactly into that special context. There can be no doubt that the stimulus for the story and the narrative must have taken shape during the Babylonian exile.
All the evidence says the Tower of Babel was a real building. But why does the Bible say it was never finished? Could it have been destroyed? Just as the Bible says. For generations, artists have depicted the Bible's Tower of Babel in all shapes and sizes. But now, scholars are convinced that the story was inspired by a real building. A 7-tiered ziggurat located in what we now know as Iraq. Today, 2,500 years on, only the foundations remain.
As you can see, it doesn't resemble much of what it looked like in the past. But you would be a day or two ride away and you'd see this large, mountain-like shape coming up out of the horizon.
It's believed the original tower was almost 300 feet square and close to 300 feet high. To have built a tower that big would have taken 17 million mud bricks, with each handmade on site. Incredibly, 2,500 years later, some of those original bricks still survive.
We're at the base of the core of the tower, and Here's a rare opportunity where you can see some of the original baked fire bricks that encase the central core still remaining. That's a real brick from the Tower of Babel. I'm holding it right in my hand. It's the original real McCoy.
The original fired brick, the huge foundations and the new evidence from the ancient tablet, revealing the tower and its builder, King Nebuchadnezzar II, all point to a very real structure. An awe-inspiring tower of biblical proportions. But what did it actually look like, looming over Babylon? Now, for the first time, the latest evidence will meet cutting-edge 21st century technology. Dr. Matthew Nichols, an archaeologist and computer modeler, will attempt to recreate the ancient world's most spectacular building in all its glory.
When I'm making 3D digital models of the past, what we start with is the evidence, like any ancient historian or archaeologist would. So we survey what evidence is available for this building, and there's actually quite a lot. So we put all of this together, and it gives us a good basis for starting to reconstruct it.
After months of research and weeks of computer modeling, Dr. Matthew Nichols can finally bring the Tower of Babel back to life.
We're looking here at the site of the temple in ancient Babylon, this big blank space more or less in the center of the city is where it stood. The ziggurat itself, we can build up in layers sort of like a wedding cake. And immediately I do that, you can see this is going to be a really substantial building. To get up to that base, you need a staircase to climb up. So the next thing to go in has to be some sort of staircase. And we know, again, from pictures and from excavation, that there's a system of staircases running up the south face to get people up to that first level. So I've put them in here. The next layers in this ziggurat wedding cake are these intermediate levels, each one set in from the predecessor and climbing up above it. So you go up and up each intermediate layer, all the way, all 6 of them, and you find yourself on this top platform.
The animation reveals the true scale of the tower depicted on the ancient tablet. But while records confirm its shape and dimensions, little was known about the temple perched on top of the building. Once the crowning glory of the Tower of Babel, the temple was the sole reason for the existence of any ziggurat.
The idea of this temple was a way to bring the gods to Earth and to allow people from Earth to communicate with the gods.
But what did the temple at the summit look like on top of the tower? Incredibly, a clue to answering the question was discovered just 10 miles away from Babylon at another great structure. This is Borsippa, the crumbling remains of another of King Nebuchadnezzar's prized ziggurats. Today, it's just a fraction of its original size, but still dominating the landscape 2,500 years after it was constructed.
If you were standing here, you could see the Tower of Babylon over there. Imagine yourself in the past. There would be nothing over 2 stories tall except these ziggurats.
Buried within the rubble of this crumbling tower, archaeologists discovered a clay cylinder, inscribed with an ancient text. Once decoded, it revealed an account by King Nebuchadnezzar, detailing the finishing touches to his 2 great ziggurats at Borsippa, and crucially, in the heart of Babylon.
What's really interesting about this cylinder is what it says. It gives us a clue about what the Tower of Babylon, Etemenenki, actually looked like.
To the delight of experts, the ancient text described a tower with a temple richly decorated in the finest lapis lazuli blue glazed bricks and shining jewels.
If you come to it, you would see potentially reflections from the lights on the bricks, and it would have sort of, been another kind of level of awe, I think, because it would, something literally would be piercing into your eyes and potentially blinding you, maybe even.
With the last piece of the puzzle in place, Dr. Matthew Nichols can now complete the final phase of his 3D build.
All of the accounts show a tall, imposing, richly decorated statue appropriate for the chief Babylonian god. So if we turn the temple on, The texts talk about it being decorated in this lovely lapis lazuli or blue glazed fired brick. So we put that temple on at the top with a sort of double height to it. And from the very top of it, if we go and stand on the roof up here, you get this really spectacular view out over the whole of the ancient city of Babylon, all the way out to its walls and gates and the Euphrates River and the desert plains beyond.
All the evidence says the Tower of Babel was finished, but the Bible states it was destroyed by God mid-build. So if the two towers really were one and the same, why would the Bible claim it was incomplete? Scholar Irving Finkel thinks he has the answer. He believes it goes back to the moment captured Jewish slaves arrived in Babylon for the first time and set eyes on a stepped tower that was unlike any building they'd seen before in Jerusalem.
They had no idea what lay ahead. And we can be certain that when the Tower of Babel, the ziggurat, was still in its original format, they would have seen it from a very great distance against the horizon, this towering edifice, and they must have said to themselves, what's that, what's that? And I have a feeling that it was the profile that they first saw that gave them the idea that this building was unfinished. And the whole point about the story in the book of Genesis is the work is unfinished and the building is stopped halfway through.
It's an intriguing theory. But if the Tower of Babel was a real building from antiquity, how have artists over the centuries got the distinctive design so wrong?
There isn't much description in the Bible itself, so of course that created a lot of sort of freedom, if you will, to depict what this tower must have looked like. So it's typically depicted in a kind of conical shape where you would circle around and go up the different levels. But in reality, we know it's a staged tower.
But one radical account of the Tower of Babel would prove invaluable to Renaissance and medieval artists. It was from the Greek historian Herodotus, one of the most important writers of antiquity and the so-called father of history.
Herodotus mentions the Tower of Babylon, and unfortunately, we don't know exactly how accurate the accounts of Herodotus. Very likely he was never visited the city, and this probably explains why there is likely to be very much error in his accounts. It was not until the mid to late 19th century when people began to visit Mesopotamia or modern-day Iraq and began to see these remains of these ziggurats that a picture of what a tower, an ancient Tower of Babylon, would have looked like.
But the Tower of Babel was not just another ziggurat. It was the centerpiece of Nebuchadnezzar's prized capital. So if the ziggurats at Borsippa and at Ur survived, why is there nothing of the Tower of Babel left today? Today, this is all that remains of the Tower of Babel, an overgrown ditch carved into the earth in modern-day Iraq. But all evidence suggests that the Tower of Babel was the most spectacular building of antiquity, a stairway to heaven that the Bible says incurred the wrath of God. He destroyed the tower and scattered humanity across the earth. This fantastical story is the Bible's explanation for the many languages that exist around the world.
This little story, which is actually so compact, has got a lot in it. But on one level, it seems to me a good answer to explain why it is there are so many languages in the world. It's because God got cross, decided this was arrogant behavior, had to be punished, had to be stopped.
Babylon was an international city, and so it would have had many languages. And I think having many languages and a tall tower makes sense in a story together.
Nebuchadnezzar's ziggurat was the biggest one ever made. It was the most impressive, and it must have had a very powerful effect on people who saw it for the first time and who lived under it, because wherever you were in the city, you would see this thing.
Experts believe that the Jews held captive in Babylon after the siege of Jerusalem saw the huge tower being built. At first, they were mesmerized by the awe-inspiring structure. But over time, it became a symbol of their oppression, of human aspiration, and of overreaching ambition.
When you look at the early chapters of the Bible, it is clear that some of it is drawn from the Judeans' own records, and some of it incorporates narratives which they must have encountered for the first time in Babylon, which were so powerful and striking that the authors, the philosophers who worked on the Hebrew text, incorporated them to tell their own story.
The Tower of Babel is one of the best-known stories in the Bible. But what became of the mesmerizing tower? For experts in ancient construction, the answer is all too clear.
It's critical to recognize that mud brick is a perishable structural material. It's reasonably effective in doing what it does, and that's why it's still used extensively throughout many parts of the world today. But most construction folks recognize that mud brick structures have a design life of at most 30 years. Beyond that point, unless they've been subjected to near constant maintenance, they simply dissolve and have to be reconstructed.
But historical evidence suggests that the Tower of Babel outlived its shelf life. Unbelievably, it was still in existence 250 years after the death of King Nebuchadnezzar. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great, conqueror of the Persian Empire, arrived in Babylon. He chose the city to be his capital and set about renovating the now crumbling tower.
It's taken down by Alexander the Great with the intention of reconstructing it again in a more grander way. But as we know, Alexander the Great died here at Babylon, so it was never completed.
So if the tower was taken down, what's happened to its 17 million mud bricks? Some are still here in Iraq, returning to the mud from where they came.
What you're looking at is the mud brick core, which is, of course, eroded into a sort of large dollop of chocolate, but it's basically a masonry core of mud brick. And the area around was where the encasing fired brick material was. And that, of course, has been taken away and used by people in later constructions for centuries.
The fact that most of the Tower of Babel has gone is no surprise to experts. It supports evidence of an ancient Babylonian tradition of recycling and rebuilding that continued for hundreds of years.
It must have been a very high-quality brick, otherwise people wouldn't have taken it away like they have. And there's virtually none of it left as we see here today.
While little remains of the real Tower of Babel, the biblical tale it inspired is everlasting. The story of a mighty tower in a far-off land, written by a desperate population in exile, held captive by a ruthless king. And this was their way to rewrite history. It's a fiction rooted in truth. The Tower of Babel was a real building, a genuine long-lost wonder of the ancient world.
The fact is this, that the Tower of Babel cannot be dismissed as a fable or an invention. It is, in fact, literally based on the existence of a building. We know where that building was, we know how big it was, we know what it looked like, we know who built it, and we even know the circumstances under which knowledge of this building intruded into the psychology of the people, the Judeans, who wrote that text in the book of Genesis. So there's no doubt about it that the one and the other are the same thing, and as it were, the Tower of Babel existed.